So arguably what the implicit explanatory content of the development story does here is to hold these two contradictory possibilities together. The application of the theory of free trade to poor countries with the experience of the reality of the trading order to produce an effect in which self-interest of the rich is equated with altruism. And this equation happens in many cases when those two things are clearly not able to be held together. But what is law here? One interpretation is that it's simply that these inequitable rules reflect the hypocrisy and unequal bargaining position of the powerful. So that might be Thomas Pogge's explanation. In another interpretation, it could be a case of bad rules and good intentions. This might be Chang's famous Bad Samaritan. But as Professor Gaita reminded us at the start of this lecture series, we've gone beyond a simplistic equation of international law with the interests of the powerful. But if law is not just a reflection of power, we need also to see the complexities of relations of power within the structures of international law itself. Indeed, if we see every bad rule as an exception to an otherwise good system, or as a distortion of power in a neutral structure of rules, it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to think through the contradictions of the international legal system in a useful way. As Sheikh puts it, if every inequality, every abuse, every infraction is seen as an aberration, as a demonstration of the fact that the order has not yet reached its full potential, how might we also hope that this same order will eventually be equal to its own avowed aspirations? So the point here is that the critiques I've mentioned pretty much all argue for the reform of international legal rules. And this is important, but unlike these thinkers, I don't think law is simply secondary or epiphenomenal to the problem. Law is not just a reflection of power. Instead, it's both a product of power and a source of it. It's undoubtedly structured by power, but it also structures the forms that power can take. And in international law's own history, and in particular its intimate relationship with imperialism, what this means is that its key categories allow space for certain arguments in ways which are complicit with imperialism's legacy. So what I would do at this point, had I more time, is evidence some of the ways that this arose through an intertwined history of development and contemporary international law. But suffice to say that together, international law and development work to vest responsibility downwards, not upwards, into the international community. Law and development are also both examples and generators of a particular structure of knowledge. This structure supports what we might call an export theory of knowledge, in which knowledge is generated in one place for its application to others. In the legal field, this produces what Brian Simpson, that other Simpson, has called the export theory of human rights, or in the development field, what Eric Reinert has described as the export of economic rhetoric for others. But let me move then to the second problem with development having become a proxy for the question of global well-being, and that is the centrality to the development project of economic growth. So the concept of gross national product, GNP or GDP, was invented in the 1950s around the same time as the development concept. It was a number that provided a scientific ratification for the United States in its position as the world's most powerful nation. It also replaced race as the measure of superiority between peoples in ways that the Holocaust had made unpalatable, even to the then still imperial powers. The end of the war, the success of the independence struggles and the fatigue of empire may have meant that the former colonies were increasingly decolonising, but the universalisation of what we call international law during the imperial period meant that colonies could only decolonise through self-determination as nation-states, and that too within their former colonial boundaries, as students of international law will remember, is expressed in the doctrine uti possidetis. So even with the realisation that the promise of the promise of formal sovereign equality, nation-states could still be ordered in a hierarchy, but with GDP instead of race as the securing value. What secured this ladder was not the increasingly unpalatable idea of immutable racial difference, but a promise that states at the bottom were included within the bosom of the international community and set on a path toward joining the ranks of the chosen few developed states at the top. So development immediately provided a way of ordering the world in which everyone was included on formally equal terms, but in which a hierarchy, and pretty much the old hierarchy, was maintained. Because GDP was the linchpin of the global order newly structured around a promise, the key to that promise, economic growth, had to lie at the heart of the project. Accordingly, economic growth was and remains the secret beating heart of development. According to the economic growth theory, as I'm sure you all know, the rising tide lifts all boats. In other words, by increasing overall wealth, even if the rich get richer, some of it is eventually meant to trickle down to the poor. And that idea took hold. It captured the zeitgeist for all sorts of historical and political reasons. It was quickly embraced by people of all political and geopolitical stripes. Communism, which was equally, if not more, developmental than the First World, also embraced the need for growth as axiomatic. So even if there was fierce contestation about how growth should be achieved, growth as the objective was immediately entrenched. Now, as time wore on, and people began to realise the inadequacy of national income as the measure for development success, many other definitions of development, and crucially many other measurements of development, were devised, perhaps most famously the Human Development Index, devised by Mahbub ul Haq, and the UNDP in the 1990s, which was a measure that added life expectancy and literacy to come up with a single indice. Amartya Sen too is famous for reconceptualising development as freedom using what he calls the capabilities approach. But even the most famous reconceptualisations, such as Sen's, still have economic growth at their heart. So the shift is not away from growth as the determinant, but growth plus. And international law and institutions have stayed very much within the paradigm. So the bank, for example, the World Bank, occupational hazard to just call it the bank. The most recent response to criticisms about the inadequacy of growth has been to shift to inclusive growth. And many NGOs have tried to modify the formula by demanding what they call pro-poor growth. The G20's latest summit declaration even reverses the emphasis, recognising that 2010 marks an important year for the MDGs and reaffirming the commitment to assist the poorest countries, but situating that reaffirmation within and dependent on the main game, which is broader global growth. So besides the obvious problems with growth, and not just growth but gross national growth as a measure of the improvement of life, and with the way it skates over the problem of inequality, the centrality of growth to the development project has also had the effect of setting the environment and development against each other. So that within the vocabulary of international law, it seems impossible to be both for the environment and for economic justice. And of course, development and environment have often been antagonistic discourses. So common wisdom has typically been, well, let's tackle poverty now and clean up later. People talk about an environmental Kuznets curve, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, in which cities undergoing rapid development peak at a certain level of pollution and then quickly improve as society gets richer. But although that might be true of air quality and the pollution of waterways, it's becoming clearer that the idea of cleaning up might be possible when we're talking about ambient environmental degradation. There are some things that can't be reversed. So carbon emissions, for example, just keep increasing the richer you get. Biodiversity loss is dramatic and accelerating. Fishery collapse is widespread. In fact, extinction rates are significantly higher than they have been for millions of years. So biodiversity loss arguably can't be replaced. CO2 emissions, the effects of the concentrations going up also arguably can't be reversed. But I can almost see your mouths moving and saying, doesn't sustainable development address precisely that question? And yes, sustainable development is exactly the way that international institutions have tried to deal with the urgent need for 4 billion of the world's people to raise their standard of living, combined with the inconvenient fact that we're already operating at the very edge of the Earth's capacity, if not beyond it. But as you can see from this quote, and taking us back to the second problem with development, economic growth is still the secret beating heart of the development project. Climate change, let alone biodiversity loss, is just a complicating factor. Returning then to the broader question, the capture by development of the question of global well-being, and in particular the combined operation of the two factors I've just outlined. That is, the way that the development story locates the causes and therefore solutions of poverty within the present circumstances of poor countries and the centrality of economic growth. Combined with international law's structural tendency to localise responsibility to the nation state, this means that when international legal solutions to global poverty are proffered, including human rights-based solutions, they do not have any bite between nations, but only within them. In other words, it's difficult, if not impossible, to use international law against the international. This toothlessness, as we might call it, consistently de-radicalises possibilities for thinking about ways to address the question of global poverty and removes the question of how we share the earth from the table. So, for example, when we call for human rights, the way that international law works means that those rights are directed at the nation-state within which individuals are situated. They cannot be claimed, for example, against former imperial powers or against rich states and their subsidies, nor even against the international financial institutions. Similarly, calls to link labour standards to international trade would piggyback on the enforcement mechanisms of the trade regime to require poor states to respect human rights or labour standards, and incidentally privilege products from rich countries, surely human rights in their most imperial guise. But this toothlessness also means that calls for a more equitable global distribution of wealth cannot bite. The idea that we can reduce poverty without affecting the distribution and accumulation of wealth is nonsense. But by centring the development story on growth, the promise to the poor is that they must invest their hopes of getting richer in increases in the overall size of the pie. This is meant to increase the size of each morsel proportionately. And if this also increases the size of the rich country's slice of the pie, or of rich people in the poor countries, well, hey, it's just a collateral benefit again of doing good for the poor. Self-interest and altruism happily coinciding. But of course, according to this logic, there can be no question of the pie being shared differently, or really even of countenancing that the pie might be of limited size. Finite size, I should say. But arguably, the environmental facts call into question a development promise based on an infinitely expanding pie. Those facts and the speed of the consumption of the Earth's resources reveal that we can't just tweak at the edges of a business-as-usual approach. We're already using 1.4 planets. Those of us in rich countries consume such a large proportion of the world's resources in an economic system which has been called a take, make and break model of consumption that it's hard to see how we can make a good faith promise of equivalence. Given that the planet could only sustain 1/3 of its current population if we all had the footprint of an Australian, what is it exactly that we're promising? Well, one answer would be to recognise the impossibility and abandon the promise, and to fortify the rich world against the clamour to get in, and of course some people suggest that that's already happening. But arguably we don't need such a dystopic vision of the future if we accept that what thinking about poverty and the environment together really means is that we need to rethink how we share the earth. Of course, versions of this argument have been around in many circles for a long time, but they've been relatively marginal to the development project and to international institutions so far. But in the spirit of never wasting a good crisis, it may be that the looming environmental problems and their global impacts cause us to rethink the development promise in a way which we haven't so far been able to. So what then might we do? Dramatic pause. This brings me to my final point, which is really the second effect of the development concept and international law combining. This second international legal effect, we might call it, of development as a proxy for well-being is that development becomes both process and horizon. Development is both means and end. It's what we are trying to achieve and it's the way we achieve it. So it's both the building of a bridge and the abstract promise of a better life. It's both the implementation of a law reform project in PNG and, as Jenny Beard has put it, a numinous yearning for a better life. Because of this character as both process and horizon, international law is consistently instrumentalised to the development project, foreclosing the more open concept of justice which international law arguably promises as its horizon. So going back to the example of the way that human rights has shifted from being antagonistic to development to having become part of it, the question is, has that inclusion happened because development has taken on board the criticisms emanating from the human rights field in ways that minimise suffering, or, no, I'd suggest not. Instead, human rights in the context of development have arguably been transformed to facilitate their incorporation into the project without disrupting its basic tenets. So Upendra Bakshi, for example, has called these new human rights trade-related, market-friendly human rights. But where does all of this leave us then? Well, I would suggest that it should at least make us a little wary of the politics of good intentions. In his play about the martyrdom of Bishop Thomas Becket, Eliot wrote, "The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason." The line is meant to explain Beckett's realisation that his willingness to be sacrificed was wrongly motivated by the martyrdom which could come from it, rather than self-sacrifice without glory. But our legal system generally reverses that judgment and concentrates on the deed, not the reason. The reversal is arguably necessary for balancing the interests of the well-intentioned actor with the protection of the person who is the subject of that action. But in the international development project, the judgment is reversed again and is assessed primarily by reference to the intentions of the developer rather than the effect of those actions on the person being developed. So often the politics of good intentions can provide a cover for poor outcomes. So we may well have done the wrong things, but we're assessed on the reason, not the effect. This is exacerbated by the way that accountability measures usually involve accountability to the donors, not to the subjects of developmental interventions. In other words, we assess ourselves and we base that assessment on our intentions. But although good intentions might be morally relevant to the individual, when they're combined with the force of law, those intentions must be tempered by the responsibilities of power. This is even more true of institutions. This responsibility of power, I would suggest, is not answered by reference to intentions. Which brings me full circle back to the question of authority and the practices which law authorises. As Sheikh puts it, in the context of interrogating what she calls the benevolence of empire, which for her includes development, all these interventions then were in the service of enabling the conditions of modernity to emerge in the belief that they would serve better the interests and well-being of humanity. Without adjudicating on the sincerity of this claim, what remains indisputable is the authority with which such a gesture can be made, the vantage point from which it asserts itself. In other words, it's probably natural to think of one's own way of life as the best. It's another thing to have both the desire and the power to impose that way of life on others, whether out of self-interest or altruism or some combination of the two. So, all of this is not to say that those who campaign to make poverty history, for example, or who donate money to aid projects are not, that their conduct is not morally relevant. And certain positions are very important in this regard. So Peter Singer's recent book, for example, The Life You Can Save, which I'm sure some of you have read, is ethically compelling in its emphasis on asking people in rich countries, meaning us, to give something up. It's striking in the way that it reveals how living more simply is possible by thinking about the idea of what counts as a necessity and what counts as a luxury by situating those wants and needs in a global context. In that sense, it's very important for putting the question of sacrifice and the unavoidable question of distribution on the table. But arguably, The approach of donating money for aid without a consideration of the structural factors that permit other people's luxuries to become our necessities is morally relevant, but in my view, unlikely to produce the results that it seeks. And although it might seem much more difficult to change the rules of the global economy than to set up a direct debit to an aid organisation, I think we're up to the challenge. The enormous political solidarity that was demonstrated in Toronto last week, and indeed at every multilateral economic summit meeting since Seattle in 1999, shows that people do care about the suffering of strangers in faraway places, and indeed of the state of the planet. But in my view, to date, the development project has captured a great deal of that energy for justice and channelled it in ways which have shown themselves to be unlikely to end poverty in our time, as they say. The visibly diminishing capacity of the earth to sustain us might provide the impelling political force we need to make the shift away from development certainties. But if Thomas Pogge is right in suggesting that it is easier to make good laws than good men, then we can't simply argue for the reform of laws and institutions which hurt the poor, but we also need to think carefully about the institutional structures which support the production of those unfair laws in the first place. Both development and international law are the children of imperialism and carry the legacy of that inheritance. And they're both institutionalised structures of knowledge with ready armies of experts bearing solutions to the world's problems. The big differences, though, are that law has a formal structure, and its promised horizon is what I would suggest is the more open notion of justice. So it will only be by rejecting law's instrumentalisation to the development project and by refusing the replacement of justice by development as its horizon that there might be a chance to harness the widespread faith and political action in international law and human rights in ways which save it for the poor and which breathe life back into its powerful symbolic promise for most of the world. Thank you.